Enkiri here, and today we're going to talk about powerlifting and why I don't like it. Last week we talked about some of the issues that I have with modern bodybuilding, and some of you guys got a little bit butthurt because you felt like I was picking on your favorite niche gym-based ideology. So in the name of equity, today, in the name of equity, we're going to kind of flip the script and we're going to pick on another niche gym-based ideology. This time, a performance-based one instead of an appearance-based one. So if you came in all hot-headed last week thinking that I was just picking on bodybuilding to pick on guys who value aesthetics over performance, I wasn't, and I will be waiting in this room until I receive your apology.
1,000 years later.
There are no sacred cows, man. I'll burn any of them, even my own, eventually. The point of this series is really just to make you think, right? There are pros and cons to everything, and it would be naive to become so emotionally tethered to your particular ideology that you can no longer see its shortcomings. And remember, the title is tongue-in-cheek here, guys. It's just a playful jab. Just because I don't like something or because I point out some of its potential flaws, that doesn't mean that you aren't free to partake in that activity, and it really doesn't change the impact that that endeavor has on your life at all. I'm just voicing information that really already exists for all of us to see, and then you guys are free to proceed however you best see fit after the fact. But I'm not policing morals, okay? And I'll be right back. I'm going to go file that into my folder of things that I shouldn't have to say, but sometimes feel like I have to say. And just real quick, guys, if you're in the market for a top-notch meal prep company, then be sure to check out FlexPro meals and use code ENKIRIELITE for 20% off your order. The link is in the description. The food's legit. It usually arrives in just a couple days. They have a bunch of different high-protein meal options, and it's a really easy and convenient way to help keep your diet and your macros on track. And now, back to your regularly scheduled program. Anywho, the goal of powerlifting is to lift the most weight possible in the squat, bench press, and deadlift for a 1-rep max. Hard stop. It is perhaps the simplest and most objective weight room endeavor that one can partake in, matched only by the sport of Olympic weightlifting in that regard. So, with that definition in place, as well as bearing in mind from last week's video what my own personal fitness preferences and goals are, let's move into the meat of the video and discuss why I don't like powerlifting. And so today I want to give you guys 3 primary reasons. All right, we'll start with reason number 1. It is an overly narrow scope. Reason number 2, kind of feeding off of reason number 1, the potential for overuse injuries is high. And then reason number 3, something a little bit different. We're going to call it the concept of strength dysmorphia. So kicking off with reason number 1, why I don't like powerlifting, the scope is too narrow. And this is actually similar to the issues that I discussed with bodybuilding last week, right? Bodybuilding promotes muscular hypertrophy above all else, maxing out your RPG character stats in a skewed and highly imbalanced fashion. And powerlifting, it shifts this same concept, but instead onto the idea of maximal strength above all else. So even though the sport is hinged upon a performance component, which we all know that I'm a fan of performance components, that component is incredibly narrow. And Jim Wendler has even talked about this idea before in the past. I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but he said something along the lines of, when I was at my peak in powerlifting, I could waddle up to the platform and squat 1,000 pounds, but outside of that context, I was useless. And that's a pretty extreme example, but the sport of powerlifting is pretty extreme in the narrowness of its scope, right? Not only are you relegated to 3 specific lifts, not even in terms of competition, and so in terms of most of your training, not even variations of those lifts, but those 3 exact specific competition lifts. But within that framework, you're also relegated to the 1-rep max as being the only indicator of any value or of any progress within the sport. And a 1-rep max is a far off different kind of endeavor from lifting a sub-maximal weight, right? You have to practice it to truly get good at it, but by prioritizing it above all else, you start to lose out on other rep ranges that have their own inherent value. But there's no reason to really train in those rep ranges because they don't necessarily contribute to directly to the concept of maximal strength. A good example of this is the Widowmaker squats that I did back in early 2020, I think it was. I ended up hitting sets of I did 315 for 22 reps, 325 for 20 reps, and then 335 for 20 reps, as well as 350 or 355 for like 15 or 18, something in that rep range. I don't remember quite what it was. That was something that I never would have done a few years ago. It's something that I never would have done when I was focusing more on powerlifting. It really has no place in powerlifting training. It does not contribute to the 1 rep max. But I wrote an entire article about the myriad of benefits that I got from that particular training cycle, just from striving for the Widowmaker sets, for the 20 rep squat sets. And so that's just a single example of the kind of thing that you might miss out on with that hyper focus on 1 rep max training. As well, by focusing on 3 lifts over everything else, absolutely everything else, you really end up pigeonholed. A lot of holes start to develop in your game, right? They start to develop in other areas in the body because neglect, it's really kind of the nature of the beast here. Things that don't positively contribute to that overly specific goal of pushing up the 1 rep max on those 3 specific lifts are kind of pushed away to the side because they end up becoming a waste of time and a waste of resources. But the irony is that ultimately those holes that get created because of that neglect are going to lead to the inability to continue on with the endeavor. And here, I'm not just referring to other physical qualities lagging behind, physical qualities like power, conditioning, etc., etc. That would be part of it. But even other things like muscle groups that would be considered unimportant, like the hip flexors or even the core muscles, strength qualities around the core, like core stability, things like that. They tend to get neglected, right? Now, these issues are actually pretty easy to rectify in a general sense, but like I said, they often get ignored for long periods of time because they don't directly contribute to the task at hand, right? So I just had a strong client of mine who, for all intents and purposes, he kind of graduated from my coaching recently, just these past few weeks. He came to me, he was beat to hell, and he was not capable of lifting anything without pain anymore. He couldn't really even move his joints, his hips specifically, most specifically, through a full range of motion without pain. So we restructured things, right? We took a few steps back, and then from there we kind of armed him with the tools and the knowledge that he needed to move forward and train hard again, and do so in a pain-free fashion, be able to move his joints through full ranges of motion, fuller ranges of motion in a pain-free fashion, as well as progressively load them from there. And so now he's pain-free, his body feels better than ever. He said he feels like he's a teenager again, and he wants to start kind of training conjugate on his own again, now with this new lease on life, with these new tools at his disposal. And so simple solutions like that, right, that we provide core stability training, mobility work, isolated strength work for the hip flexors, the hip adductors and abductors, those kinds of simple things, that's what brought him back from the grave. But those are the things that often get ignored kind of in the whole mess of the game here. And in my opinion, they are frequently ignored. The reason they're frequently ignored is because they do not directly contribute to the goal of pushing more weight on the squat, bench press, and deadlift. And personally, I only even know of these solutions because I fell victim to this exact same trap myself. I created these exact same holes in my own game through this overly narrow scope of training. And with that, I had actually lost a lot of my natural athleticism because of it. As well, my hips also just kind of felt like shit in general. Running, for example, began to feel cumbersome. It began to feel sloppy. And still just being in my mid to late 20s at the time, I felt that was unacceptable. And so with that, I kind of started searching for methods and tactics to fill in those holes, to fill in those gaps. And now, since I've kind of stopped focusing on powerlifting training, in the last couple years, I've actually been able to jump higher than I've ever jumped in my life and sprint faster than I've ever sprinted before in my life. And I did both of those things, I achieved both those things north of the age of 30. But even if we compare powerlifting to something like Strongman, for example, Strongman is a much better method of building fitness than powerlifting. It forces you to be strong, but it also includes high rep work, timed work, lots of loaded carries. It forces you to lift awkward implements, which is a whole different type of ballgame. And here, I have a theory that's going to piss some people off. Watch the guy who can lift a lot of weight on a barbell with bad technique. That dude is going to be dummy strong, right? There's no object that guy isn't going to be capable of manhandling. Now, compare that guy, the dummy strong guy, to the guy who has an impeccable technique on the barbell, but he gets stapled when the bar moves half an inch off the ideal bar path. That dude's strength is based on precision, and he's not going to have the same level of dummy strength as the first guy. I even know guys who can't lift as much as me on a barbell, but who I would tell you are stronger than me just because I can see it. I can just see it in the way that they can manhandle awkward objects. It's just a different type of game. It's a different type of brute force, man. I really don't know how to describe it. So I just call it dummy strength. And Strongman also forces you to be able to perform at a high level of intensity for up to and potentially even over a full minute continuously. Right? You got the timed work I was talking about. A lot of events involve pushing, dragging, carrying. All those events, they last for a decent amount of time. A far cry from a 1 rep max effort against a barbell. As well, there are typically multiple events in a competition, multiple events that require different strength qualities. You got things that involve a combination, different combinations, right? You got the 1 rep max work, AMRAP work, pretty intense conditioning style work, among other things. And so the level of work capacity that's required to thrive at that competition, to actually get through that competition and perform at a high level throughout it, is actually pretty insane. And that has to be built through training. And so overall, this style of training is actually much more well-rounded, and it builds along many other physical qualities and physical capacities beyond 1 rep max strength on 3 specific lifts. And so ultimately, is going to create far fewer holes in the long run, right? So the scope of powerlifting, by contrast, is overly narrow and overly specific, and over time, I would argue that is going to create a lot of problematic holes in a lot of athletes. This leads me to point number 2, which is the risk of overuse injuries. So not only do we have just 3 lifts that matter here, right? But we also have to practice those 3 specific lifts with high volumes and at high intensities. Otherwise, we will simply never get skilled enough at them to actually be good at the sport. Further, because the only goal here is to lift more weight on these 3 lifts within the confines of the rules of powerlifting, you also end up with a lot of extreme or exaggerated positions that end up being encouraged, like encouragement to shorten the range of motion, for example, as well as to decrease the lever arms involved in overcoming the resistance. And so shortening the range of motion, that's how you end up with really wide stance on a sumo deadlift. That's how you end up with a really, really high arch on a bench press. Now, if you take people with certain predispositions or certain conditions, and they practice something like that, a really extreme arch over and over again for many years, that can potentially lead to irritations in the lower back, especially when you couple that with intense training on the squat and the deadlift, which already greatly taxes the lower back. Then with the squat and the deadlift, the goal in terms of powerlifting really becomes kind of trying to get maximal engagement of the hips, maximal hip engagement through the shortest range of possible in order to maximize your efficiency, your technical efficiency. And so what you end up with all that, those concepts being put together, is basically people who are trying to create as much crossover as possible between their squat and their deadlift in order to maximize the carryover between the two, so that the training of one has a positive impact on the training of the other. So that by getting strong legs and strong hips on my squat, that also gives me a strong deadlift just by default. And so with that, what you end up with is you potentially have a guy who's practicing a wide stance sumo deadlift all the time, and you couple that with moderately wide stance on a low bar squat, an extreme low bar positioning for the squat in order to shorten the lever arm there. And then you practice these techniques over and over and over again for years on end at high intensities while ignoring those components that I discussed in point number 1. And ultimately, you end up with a very short lifting career. Even worse than this is when you see it in really young lifters. And so with raw powerlifting exploding in popularity in recent years, the sport has become much more mainstream. With that, it's kind of taken over a lot of the strength training ideology in gyms, at least across the United States. I know globally as well, but even in just commercial gyms, it's kind of taken over a lot of the strength training ideology. and even amongst people who are never actually going to compete in powerlifting. And so you end up having a lot of young lifters with minimal experience and no pre-existing base of strength or muscle mass to lean on, and they're out here going to RPE 8 5 times a week on the low bar squat, followed by a top single of 3 big wheels on that max stance with sumo deadlift. And these lanky fuckers, man, they're doomed before they even get started, right? Over specialization at a young age is not ideal for sports in general, but I would argue that in terms of weight training, it's probably even worse. So, let them compete if they want to, sure, these young guys. But I see no reason to specialize towards powerlifting training at all in young athletes, really young athletes, unless you want them to fizzle out before they've even hit their physical peak. The concept of dad strength is rooted in truth, right? And that truth is that maximal strength is a process that can actually be accrued successfully over many, many years without degradation, unlike power, for example, which is known to start to dip as soon as you get past the age of 30, I believe is the number we typically think of. With maximal strength, that is not the case. A lifter, an athlete, can continue to accrue maximal strength for decades into their 40s, potentially even into their 50s. And so a lifter should spend at least, at a minimum, several years building a generalized base of strength and muscle before they actually specialize in powerlifting style training. And like I said, even if they want to compete during that period of generalized training time, that's fine. But they really should not be specializing until they have that solid base already built. If you play your cards right, you can actually continue to get stronger in your 40s and 50s, like I said. And Dave Ricks is probably a supreme example of this. I think he's 62 now. He's still going and still getting stronger and still competing. And I can almost guarantee you, he probably didn't start powerlifting until at least his late teens. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't until his 20s. And even then, the level of specialization involved in the training process 30 or 40 years ago when he started doing it was probably not nearly as prolific as it is today, with the explosion in popularity of the sport and of the sport of raw powerlifting and the existence of social media to kind of support all of that. Just think about the number of young guys who blow up in this game like a freaking shooting star, right? They come seemingly out of nowhere with some really impressive lifts at a really young age. They get a taste of those sweet, sweet internet likes, and then they destroy their body trying to maintain that look 365 days a year until they fizzle out just as quickly as they emerged, right? 2 years later, you'll find yourself going, oh yeah, I forgot all about that guy. I wonder whatever happened to him. And finally, we're on to point number 3, and I'm going to try to keep this one brief so we can close out the video, but I want to talk about a concept. We're just going to call it strength dysmorphia. Just like last time, we talked about bodybuilding as potentially promoting body dysmorphia. Powerlifting, I'm going to argue, creates a similar pitfall in regards to how much weight that you can lift. And this is something that I've actually thought of in the past, but I never assigned it a name, right? Now, I had a commenter on a recent video. He used this exact term, though, strength dysmorphia. You can free to chime in, man. I'll give you credit for it. I'm not trying to steal the name from you, but I think it's a good thing to talk about. This guy asked me if I think that it is a thing, and I do think that it is a thing. And so what happens is you have this incredibly objective endeavor. Who can lift the most weight on these specific lifts with these specific rules in place, right? Now, this endeavor is by nature not suited for everybody. Physically, it can often be like trying to jam a square peg into a round hole because we have these very specific lifts with this single specific implement that we're all performing for the sake of standardization. Psychologically, it can create feelings of inadequacy when somebody becomes overly emotionally invested in it as an endeavor and ultimately feels like they don't stack up, feels like they are not good enough as a person. If I'm a 500-pound squatter and the elite guys are doing 650 and my entire identity is being a strong powerlifter, that can potentially take me down some depressive rabbit holes, right? There's no world where a guy who squats 500 pounds isn't strong as fuck. But by constantly comparing himself against these other guys who are on a next level in this highly objective but singularly focused endeavor that he's super emotionally invested in, he may fuck himself up mentally, or with that, even physically. Now, he may use this as motivation to try to chase those carrots, and a small percentage of guys are inevitably going to catch them as well, right? But a bigger percentage of them are going to fail to catch them. And in the process of doing so, they may have beaten themselves to shit trying to catch them, a la point number 2. As well, they may have beaten themselves to shit psychologically if and when they fail. Now, I'm not saying don't try your hardest. I'm not saying fuck powerlifting altogether, but I am saying try to keep things in perspective. Excelling at this endeavor requires a specific type of person, and some of those attributes are simply beyond your control. So try not to take it too hard if you aren't the one. Now, I know some of you are probably saying that this is no different than any other sport. Every sport kind of tiers its athletes ultimately, right? But in my opinion, it kind of is different. In team sports, for example, everybody matters. It didn't matter that Jordan was better than Kerr. Jordan needed Kerr just as much as Kerr needed Jordan, or those championships wouldn't have happened. If we look at lower ranks, college, and even high school, not everybody makes it to the next level. Obviously, the funnel gets smaller and smaller, and there's always going to be disappointment involved with failing to make it to the next level. But for some reason, that cold, hard slap of pure objectivity provided by powerlifting, it just seems to hit a little bit harder. It bites a little bit different. It's harder to rationalize your way out of it, and the ability that it creates for such direct comparisons can potentially lead to problematic patterns of behavior in susceptible individuals. So this is just something for you guys to think about as you move forward in your journey, okay? Competition is great. It's fun. It's a unique and exhilarating challenge. But ultimately, I would caution you to take a step back if you find yourself falling into the kind of negative thought processes that I've described here, or even doing things that may potentially harm your long-term physical well-being simply for the sake of adding a few more pounds onto your total. Anyway, that about wraps it up for today, guys. Another long one, another pretty long one, but I do hope that even if you disagree with most of what I'm saying here, that you're still able to find some useful tidbits to extract from the overall overarching message. But I'm curious to hear what everybody else's thoughts are. What do you guys think about modern powerlifting and the culture surrounding it? Let me know in the comments, and let's get some productive discussion going. And that's all I got for today, guys. Please remember to hit the like button before you go. Subscribe to my channel. Leave me some love in the comments. All that good stuff. Check out EnkiriEliteFitness.com for online coaching and training programs. Sign up for my Patreon. And no matter what your endeavor of choice, keep training hard. I'll catch you guys next time.